Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 313. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, April the 29th, from the James Strong Studio in western St. Charles County. It appears that spring has finally come to the Midwestern U.S. Sunny and 70, or maybe partly sunny and 70 is the forecast for today, which is just about where we need to be. Here in the Midwest, we've had it cooler and kind of more dreary than normal, but that's okay. If you wait long enough, it's just going to get warm. And starting on Monday, it's the 1st of May. We just don't get snow in May, okay, folks? It's going to be nice here. So, for those of you living in the heartland here, like me, spring is here. Spring has sprung. So we all need to be smiling. The topic of today's podcast: UFOs, UAPs, ET, the visitors, whatever we want to call them. Is it baloney? Is it for real? We've all heard of the cases and I've done stories. I've done podcasts on Roswell. I've done them on the Cape Girardeau, Missouri UFO. I've done them on countless UFOs throughout the world. In fact, even the air base over in the UK. There have been lots and lots and lots of, I would say, documented cases reported by viable sources, to prove that there's something out there that we don't understand. And I'll just leave it at that. Is it men from Mars? We can discuss that. Is there something that's been going on for a long, long time that we don't understand? That's something you can't deny, okay? What I'm going to do is something that's a little bit different. I'm going to do a story on a very famous UFO UAP that, frankly, I never heard about until this week. It has to do with a close encounter of the third kind, where you actually meet the visitors in Brazil, Varginha, Brazil. No, I'd never heard of that place before either. I had never heard of the whole incident, but it's certainly fascinating. And I was a bit skeptical at first, and then when I started to investigate it a little bit further, I became less skeptical. We'll get into that story, that essay, in the second part of the podcast. First part, a couple things. I wanted to give you an update on the 1951 Jaguar Mark 7. Last Saturday after the podcast, I went and I began putting that thing together. Actually, I staged everything out so I could see where the parts are. Friends, there are so many parts to put on that car that it's, I looked at it and I thought, okay, I remember taking all these parts off, but now I have to put them back on. And it took me about a year to take them off, okay? And you can make the case that they're going to be harder to put back on than to take off, or at least to put back on and determine that they help the car run than to take them off. So I have to kind of psych myself up to feel, okay, this is not going to be done in a few weeks or even a few months. So the goal now is to take everything on the floor of my shop and put it on the car. When the floor is empty, the car is done. Now, it's kind of a very basic, very rudimentary theory as to what's going on, but until that floor is empty, till all that stuff is on the car, it's not done. So I was putting little bitty parts on the firewall, little electrical parts, which is fine, and we certainly need those. But then I started thinking, you know what? I can put a little 2x2 relay onto this car and free up 2 square inches on the floor, or I can put a radiator in the car and square up and free up 2 square feet on the floor. So perhaps the day, and Dad's coming out to help me today, so perhaps today I can make some progress into, sure, putting stuff onto the Jaguar, but most importantly, maybe freeing up from some floor space so I can actually walk around the shop. The other option is rent a third bay. That's not going to happen. So anyway, after the podcast, it's off to the shop. work on putting together the Jaguar. I shared some pictures on Facebook. I will share pictures on Facebook again as to what we've done and the progress we've made. So stay tuned. Have you traveled lately? Before the pandemic hit, airports were crazy, insane. The economy was great, and everybody wanted to go everywhere. Then the pandemic hit, and nobody wanted to go anyplace. Well, things have changed, and now again, airports are getting busier, and basically, airports have just become crazy, and back to where they were before. Now, maybe more so because, a lot of people quit. Okay, the airline industry, cut a lot of people because they didn't have anything for them to do because nobody was flying. And now everybody came back and said, okay, well, you can come back now. And they said, no, thanks, I'll stay retired. Or no, thanks, I'm doing something different. Or no, thanks, whatever. So they're having trouble filling the spaces. So I think that's why things have gotten crazy. Last week, we had more problems at Southwest. They had tons of problems several months ago. They say, hey, those problems are gone. Well, they're not gone. They had another software problem and another grounding problem. So these problems, I think, are going to rear their ugly head for quite some time. But that's just how technology works. We can do so many things with technology, not just through the airport, but they make us so much more efficient until we don't have it. Okay. And I think you would all agree to that. I mean, look at the way we do our banking, the way we do everything. Everything's done online, which is fine until the 2%, 1%, 0.5% of the time when it doesn't work. That's okay. I'll just call somebody there and get it straightened out. No, you won't. You won't call anybody back. And if you do get a person, it's English as a second language, and they're either going to not understand you, you're not going to understand them, or they're just going to say things to shut you up, to pacify you, to get you off the phone. Okay? That's what I've found. Anyway, the airports have gotten very, very busy. And actually, the change in passenger flights have gone crazy. The busiest airport now, Denver, Colorado, believe it or not. They're number one. And actually, they were number 3 last year. They've come up to number 1 now. The busiest airport in the country, believe it or not, with an 18% increase versus 2021. But actually, when you compare some of these airports that are busy and where they were and how they've lost market share, Atlanta, Dallas-Fort Worth, O'Hare, those were some of the busiest airports. Dubai Airport, LAX was airport. Those airports, those were the super busy airports. But if you compare to the passengers that flew last year compared to the passengers that flew in 2019, right before the pandemic, Atlanta, which was the busiest airport, their figures are down by 15%. Dallas-Fort Worth, down 2%. Denver, Colorado, back to where they were. Chicago, Illinois, Chicago O'Hare, down 19%. Dubai, which for a time was the busiest airport in the world, traffic in Dubai is down 24%, or was in 2022 versus 2019. So the busiest airport in the world, Denver, Colorado, believe it or not. And I found that amazing. Other airports who have gained and lost market share. The Istanbul airport, one of the busiest in the world, is up 23% from 2019. London Heathrow is up 23%. New Delhi Airport down 13%, and it goes on and on and on. Charles de Gaulle down 25%. Okay, so airport travel has changed. It's gotten busier than in 2019, but not quite as busy in many places as it was at the peak in 2020. It's gotten busier, but not quite to the peak where it was in 2019. How's that? But that is changing. If anybody who's flown recently knows exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, let's get into today's essay. The case for the UFOs, UAPs, ETs, visitors, whatever you want to call them. listening to a podcast this week. And for those of you who don't know, I've shared this before. I'll share it again. When I'm in town at the day job, part of the way I keep my sanity is we get an hour for lunch. I go for an hour walk at lunch, okay, close to 3 miles. And unless it's brutally cold, brutally hot, or pouring down rain or snow, I take that walk. And it lets me clear my mind. It lets me rest. It gets my adrenaline going, and I'm able to listen to podcasts. That's when I listen to my podcasts. It's about an hour a day during my walk. And one of the podcasts I listen to is Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is arguably the king of podcasts. He's the Larry King, the Tom Snyder, the Art Bell, whatever talk show host you want to use. He's the modern day king of radio, even though he's not on the radio. He's on a podcast. But as I've said before, in my very humble opinion, podcasts are radio. Radio is not the appliance that sits on your kitchen table or in your car. Radio is the audio media, okay? So Joe Rogan is the king. He gets people onto his podcasts that normally you never would. There's a guy I listened to this week. His name is James Fox. And basically he's a filmmaker. He makes documentaries. He's made documentaries of UFOs for, last 30 years, okay? Some are good, some are not so good, some are very good, okay? And he's done a new one. And, of course, often when Joe Rogan often has somebody on his podcast, it's to promote something they have going on, promote a book, promote a lecture series, promote a film, etc. And this is no exception. James Fox was promoting his new film. Oh God, yeah, you're really prepared here, Strong. I can't think of the name of it, but yeah, I can't think of the name of it. Something about, hey, we've seen UFOs or something like that. I don't know the name of it. Anyway, but it had to do with a close encounter of the third kind. Now, that was a movie. Just to quickly explain what close encounters are. Close encounter of the first kind is when you see something unexplainable up close. In other words, you know it's not a helicopter. You know it's not a Chinese lantern. You actually see something that you know is out of the ordinary. Close encounter of the second kind is when you not only see something, but you see evidence of something. In other words, you've seen a UFO in a field and you've seen it take off. That's a close encounter of the first kind. If you go to that field and you see charred straw beneath where the UFO was, and you have hard evidence that something was there, that's a close encounter of the second kind. Close encounter of the third kind, which are very rare, is when you've actually had physical contact with a being from the UFO, from the spaceship, from the UAP. And that's what this podcast was about. That's what this movie by James Fox is all about. And it's in a town called, it's in Brazil of all places, Varginha, Brazil. And it didn't happen last week, last month, last year. It happened in the early 1990s, the early to mid 1990s, okay, over a period of time. And as I listened to this podcast, it was intriguing. I thought, well, how did I never hear about this? And the podcast was over 2 hours long. And as you listen to this guy, he interviewed people. He went down and talked to people who firsthand saw this, because it's not like Roswell where everybody's dead. This was 30 years ago where most everybody is still alive, okay? Some of the people who saw this thing were young adults or even children. Their stories didn't change. They didn't like to talk about it. They were very emotional. And everything, according to the podcast by James Fox had on Joe Rogan's podcast with James Fox as the guest, according to this guy, it seemed very credible. It seemed very believable. It seemed very firsthand, okay, I'm kind of buying into this. However, there was a bit of sensationalism in it, probably to promote his film. There was a bit of scratching your head thinking, okay, are you really, are you throwing a few things in there for fluff, for entertainment value? So I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, he was probably about a solid 7 as far as being believable. Okay. And it's one of these things where, yeah, you want to believe it, but I don't know. But it intrigued me. I thought to myself, as much as I follow this stuff, as much as I research this stuff, why have I never heard about the Varginha UFO landing, the close encounter of the third kind? Okay. But then as I started researching this, and I've researched this extensively this week, this is nothing new. Sure, we talk about Roswell. We talk about the incident at O'Hare Airport back in the about 10 years ago, where the UFO was sighted and then went through the sky and left a ring on the cloud. I mean, the 1950s UFOs on the White House lawn, all these things. But what they have in common is they all happened here. And if you think about it, we've got 350 million people in this country, and there's 7 billion in the world. From an area standpoint, we're not the biggest country. We're second or third largest country, land mass. You would think that if there was somebody coming here, they would not just be coming to the U.S. So why do we just hear about the U.S. stories? Well, because it's in our backyard. It's a whole lot easier to investigate something that happened in Ohio than it is something that happened in Varginha, Brazil. Okay. But again, these sightings worldwide are nothing new. And you can go back 20, 40, 50 years, 20, 40, 50 centuries. Okay. The Maya artworks in Central America have spaceships. The Egyptian hieroglyphics have spaceships. The North American Indians, the drawings on the caves have spaceships. The Bible, some say, points to UFOs. Read the book of Ezekiel, okay? So this stuff is nothing new, okay? And none of those had anything to do with the United States of America. Sure, the North American Indians, that was here in this country, but there was no US of A back then, okay? And there have been reports of flying objects even before we flew. I've talked about this on my podcast more than once. There was that case where, was it the Dallas Morning News, I think, had an article about how a spaceship came through this small town. It crashed into the church tower. It wrecked in the town. They found 2 little guys in it, dead. They buried them. They had a service. And this took place in the 1880s, okay? We didn't have anything that flew back then except for balloons. There were no aircraft. There were no spaceships. This couldn't have been mistaken for anything else other than what it was. And it was from a prominent Dallas newspaper. It wasn't in the editorial section. It wasn't in the comic book section. It was in the news portion of the section. They reported it as news, okay? Even recently, the Tic Tac UFOs, the gimbal UFOs, the Go Fast UFOs, all reported by Colonel Favor and others in the military. And for the first time, these military guys finally said, look, I know what I saw. And the government's saying, yep, we believe you. And please, if you see something, please come forth. They're not burying it. And the main reason they're coming forth and not burying it is because the government admits, look, this stuff is real. It's out there, and we don't know anything about it. And if we don't know about it or where it comes from or how to counter it, that's a real problem, okay? But I'm going down another rabbit hole here, so I'm going to come back. But because I want to concentrate on this Varginha, Brazil UFO. Marco Rubio, senator from Florida. Harry Reid, since passed away, but he was Senate Majority Leader once upon a time. They all admit that it's not swamp gas, but they've not come forth with full disclosure either. The whole Bob Lazar incident Basically, you can say Bob Lazar was a nut, but then when you look at things like, well, the government says he never worked at MIT, went to MIT. Yeah, he did. He never worked for these defense contractors. Yeah, they found when they proved that he was on the payroll. He never worked at Area 51. Yeah, they had security guards who said, yeah, I knew Bob all the time. So if Bob Lazar is lying, why did the government cover up his education and work history? Okay. So getting back to this Joe Rogan, James Fox podcast. Again, I thought that was incredible. It was intriguing. It was interesting, but I had to do my own research because here's one guy promoting a film, so he has an agenda, okay? The more believable this is, the more people see his film, the more money he makes. So there's some agenda out there. So I thought if this thing is real, I can go back through history. And the internet is great because there's stuff on there that doesn't go away. So here's what I'm going to do. I found lots of stories about this Varginha UFO. Varginha Close Encounter of the Third Kind. I'm going to read 2 news stories. So forgive me for being redundant, but I'm going to be a bit redundant here because I'm going to read 2 news stories from 2 sources, okay? Then I'm going to disclose who those sources are, what those sources are, I guess I should say. And then you can make the decision whether or not this is baloney. First news story. A bizarre UFO case dubbed the Brazilian Roswell. And again, this story is from a while back. This isn't something that came out last week. A bizarre UFO case dubbed Brazil's Roswell has set the internet abuzz amid rumors that the video of a captured creature may exist and could soon be released. The so-called Varginha incident, an alleged UFO crash, extraterrestrial encounter, and subsequent military cover-up made global headlines back in 1996, yeah, that long ago, and sparked a media frenzy in Brazil despite official government denials that anything unusual had occurred. It remains one of the country's most famous UFO cases and sparked a wave of UFO tourism to Varginha, where many residents to this day insist the Brazilian military captured 2 alien beings and threatened local officials to be quiet. Now, more than a quarter century later, interest in the case has been renewed after the release of a documentary, Moment of Contact, which sees filmmaker James Fox return to the small town in the southwestern state of Minas Gerais to interview eyewitnesses. Now, governments tend to cover up everything they can't explain to their population. That's according to a retired Brazilian Air Force general. So this isn't just some guy. This is a retired Brazilian Air Force general, Jose Carlos Padilla. And he tells James Fox in this documentary. Now, in January 1996, local Varginha residents spotted a strange cigar-shaped object about the size of a school bus slowly fall from the sky and crash in a field. Now, Carlos de Souza, he witnessed the crash and spoke with researchers on camera back in 1996. It was floating and losing altitude, he said. It looked like a washing machine struggling, fighting to keep its altitude. The side of it was completely torn and had white smoke coming out of it. Not black smoke, like a fire, but white smoke. I thought it was like an aircraft in trouble, an airplane, so I decided to follow it. 26 years later, Mr. de Souza and the filmmaker, James Fox, returned to the crash location just up the hill from a small white farmhouse. De Souza then broke down in tears. When I arrived at the site of this very spot, I observed a lot of debris pieces. And when I got out of my car, I immediately smelled ammonia, rotting eggs, a very strong smell, and I had to cover my nose with my shirt. Mr. de Souza then said, straight away he realized it was something very different from what I was expecting. First, due to the smell. The smell made no sense. And I saw a piece. It looked like it was aluminum. I took the sheet. I took a small piece. I crumpled it up, released it. It went back to the original shape. Not unlike what happened at Roswell. Now, within minutes, Mr. de Souza said the military trucks arrived from a nearby Brazilian Air Force base, about 30 kilometers, which is 25 miles from Varginha, ordered Mr. de Souza to leave and threatened him with their guns. Now, soon after, Varginha residents were stunned as a large military presence descended on the town, cordoning off several blocks and preventing anyone from entering. A group of girls ranging in age from 14 to 21 made headlines after claiming they had stumbled across a strange creature in broad daylight around 3:30 p.m. on January 20th, 1996. The being, which was huddled next to a wall by a clump of weeds in a vacant grass-covered lot, was described as being about 4 feet tall, brown oily skin, V-shaped feet, a large head, and huge red eyes. Now, for its part, the Brazilian military said in 2010 that an official inquiry had concluded and the girls actually saw a homeless, mentally unstable man covered in mud. Now, the girls, Lilian Silva and Valqueira Silva and Katie Javier, now adults, returned to the location with James Fox to re-encounter their experiences. We were walking along here. It was in the front, and they were a little further back. Passing here, the graffiti caught my attention. I looked, and I saw the creature. I looked into its eyes and saw that it was frightened. Just as I was frightened, the creature was also frightened. I saw that it was scared of us, so it was an exchange of fears, the creature's and ours. Miss Xavier said it had red eyes, oily skin. I couldn't see an open mouth. Smiling, no, it was not happy. Shrunken back, a sad expression. It did not have hair. And it goes on and on. Different experiences with different people on this UFO. She says it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. Nowadays, she says she does think it was from another planet. Valqueira, one of the girls, said it wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. Now, what was it? I don't know. They both say, all three of them rather say, it was not a dwarf, crazy, homeless man covered in mud. Now, about 3 hours after this alleged encounter, the story goes, 2 military officers were driving along a road just around the corner from a vacant lot where the creature ran in front of their car. One of the officers, his name was Marco Cherisi, captured the creature with his bare hands and took it to a local hospital. After he captured the creature, he was smelly and had the strange feeling of something greasy or sticky all over his body that came from the creature. He developed this infection that wouldn't go away, and for 2 or 3 weeks, it was getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, that infection killed the man. He saw a stainless steel box on a table. There were doctors and people carrying clipboards, analyzing. They looked like they all seemed scared. When I looked down and saw something different, a creature with oily skin, a lot of oil like silicone, then I got scared. Now, the military told James Fox that one soldier present had a film camera that was for sure video in possession of the government. What got my attention was the foot, he said. It was shaped like a V, practically 2 fingers. What led me to believe it wasn't human was the foot, okay? And again, the Brazilian Air Force denies all this. This was a recent story, okay? And it didn't appear in The Onion or the Babylon Bee or some bizarre website. This was a story from the New York Post. That, my friends, is a very viable, believable source, okay? And I read that and I thought, okay, well, a lot of this is still hearsay, etc. James Fox reported it. So a lot of it is not quite unlike the interview that Fox gave to Joe Rogan on Rogan's podcast. So I decided to investigate a little further. And this was the story that made me scratch my head and think to myself, wow, there's more to this than meets the eye. Dateline, Varginha, Brazil. The incident that made this town a hotspot on the intergalactic search for intelligent life started quite innocently. On a Saturday afternoon stroll in January, a trio of young women decided to take a shortcut home through a vacant lot. In a clump of weeds, they said they encountered a creature like nothing they had seen before. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. It was something different. It was oily, had brown skin, rubbery limbs. 3 rounded protrusions spouted from its oversized head. Standing out in a different way was the creature's odor. One ghastly whiff weakened the knees. As for the stranger's demeanor, the women unanimously said and tactlessly agreed it was muddle-headed. When the creature wagged its big noggin dizzily in the direction of the women, they ran off. Now, word of this encounter spread rapidly through the coffee bars where Varginha's 120,000 inhabitants traded gossip, and they would meld the public image of unusual occurrences. There was a sighting, there was a cigar-shaped flying object, a mustering of Brazilian troops and vehicles from a nearby military base, and a particular bustle at a municipal hospital. Now, goaded by self-styled USO savants and a ravenous national media, residents rather matter-of-factly embraced a stupefying conclusion. Several aliens from a wayward spaceship had been captured and brutalized by troops from the Brazilian army. Now, bristling denials from the military, which once compiled a lengthy record of abuses against terrestrial population, have only served to inflame public speculation. Now, the upshot, the Army and the now infamous space aliens find themselves locked in a pitched battle for the hearts and minds of the provincial community. Now, as strange as these space celebrities might be, mere men in uniform are providing no match for the creatures of any kind. Varginha is making magazine covers throughout Brazil. Now, remember, this is a story that's a bit older, okay? This is not modern times. The extraterrestrials may not be much, but they're the biggest thing that's ever happened in Varginha, said one resident. The thing is the Army finds itself besieged on several fronts. A local mystic predicted that Varginha will suffer some kind of cataclysm this September for its retribution of the blitzkrieg of the interplanetary visitors. To some extent, Varginha is paying for its past sins. The government is paying for its past sins. The military is paying for its past sins. During the oppressive 20-year dictatorship ending in 1985, the Brazilian military eliminated any number of earthbound political enemies by disappearing them. If the Army was capable of liquidating human beings without a trace, why couldn't they carry on a dirty war with those from outer space? In truth, the current cash-strapped incarnation of Brazil's military poses little threat to anyone, least of all an enemy that might have supernatural powers. In some training exercises, Brazilian troops have been reduced to pointing their rifles and shouting "bang" in order to save ammo. In other words, the only way they're going to overcome this is by brute force because they don't have any real power. At an army base near Varginha, an inquiry concerning the extraterrestrials is received warily by a private who turns over to a sergeant, then passes along to a major. From there, there's a matter that's sent back down to another sergeant who hands the question over to Captain Eduardo Calza, the outfit's spokesman. You know, I used to get calls about this base often. Now, Captain Calza says he can't vouch for what the three women saw in January, but the activity on the base that fateful weekend, he insists, was anything but otherworldly. New inductees of Sergeant's Training School went on parade. There was a lot of stuff going on that day. Lots of stuff going on. So in Varginha, they've recently started a group called Abductees Anonymous, a research organization called Operation Right to Know. Stanton Friedman, a Canadian-based UFO expert, says Varginha has the makings of a cosmic Watergate. Now, if anything, the case may be suffering from eyewitness overkill because lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people are coming forward. By now, there have been so many sightings of the creatures, at least 7 of its last count, that it's now unclear how all these beings could have fit into a mini-sized spacecraft that was spotted here in January. Of course, if lots of people saw beings, maybe lots of people saw the same beings who were wandering around the town. Lots of us get into cars with 5 or 6 other passengers in them. Here, that's nothing new in Brazil. We get into cars like that all the time, says Mr. Pancini, who was another eyewitness. Mr. Pancini also has the most tantalizing proof as far as the videotapes go and statements by 2 young men in civilian clothes who claim to be members of the military detail that disposed of the alien visitors. It's impossible to determine the tape's authenticity. However, since Mr. Pancini won't reveal the men's names because they fear reprisal, they've not been seen. So this is another case where, hey, we got a video, but nobody can see it. But there's also a troubling lack of physical evidence unless you count the descriptions of a paw print seen by one witness. The print is said to resemble what a human hand would look like with a palm print and a space opened up between the ring finger and the pinky finger, kind of like Spock did on Star Trek, okay? Kind of like that. But this story kind of links the New York Post article, which was published recently. And it kind of mirrors the James Fox documentary, okay? The same three girls were interviewed. They saw this. It was stinky. It was something that wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. And this was an interview that was taken a long time ago. Now, where did this story come from? Now, those of you may say, the New York Post isn't as reliable a source as it could be. It is a bit of a sensational. They have a page 6, et cetera, et cetera. The New York Post is kind of like the UK Sun of the U.S. Let's say you discount that story. Let's say you say the New York Post story is just sensationalism. Consider the second story that I reported on. This second story was not recent. It was not the New York Post or the UK Sun or et cetera, et cetera. This story was written by Max Moffat, staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal on June 28th, 1996. June 28th, 1996. That's when this article was written, okay? And it was from the Wall Street Journal. Now, why would the Wall Street Journal publish an article like this? It's hard to tell. Now, the James Fox video, maybe there was sensationalism. The New York Post article kind of just mirrored the interviews by James Fox. But on June 28th, 1996, James Fox didn't know about this. In fact, James Fox himself said he first heard about this, I want to say in 2012, something like that. Okay. I had never heard of it. Many people had never heard of it, the Varginha UFO incident. But apparently it piqued the interest of the Wall Street Journal 6 months after it happened. So if this happened in January 1996, the Wall Street Journal reported on it on June 28th, 1996. So even they took 6 months before they reported on this Varginha UFO, this Varginha UAP, this Varginha close encounter of the third kind. And again, they interviewed one of the women, Katina Andreje, and she said oily brown skin, rubbery limbs, 3 rounded protrusions spouted from his oversized head. Standing out in a different way was the creature's odor. One ghastly whiff weakened the knees, okay? The story that she gave to the Wall Street Journal reporter in 1996 is identical to the report she gave to James Fox, is identical to the report that was in the New York Post article. Now, that's almost 30 years ago, 27 years ago, okay? Almost 27 years ago, this article was written. For somebody to keep that same story up for 27 years, especially because remember now, none of these people have made any money on this. Now, James Fox wants to make money on it, so he has a reason to sensationalize. That doesn't mean he has. But these 3 girls, the Army general, Mr. D'Souza, none of those have a reason to sensationalize. In fact, the Army general, this guy was an Air Force general, this Jose Carlos Padilla. He was an Air Force general. If anything, he loses credibility with this story, okay? So again, is the Varginha close encounter of the third kind, just a story made up by a whole bunch of people. Here's what I say. When listening to a story of any kind, what's more important than what the story is about is who is telling the story. And these three girls, Mr. D'Souza, the Brazilian general, have all kept their stories the same for 27 years. Why would they keep their stories the same for 27 years? If this was just some, they just want to be celebrity for a minute, queen for a day, have their moment in the sun, that doesn't last for 27 years. At least one of them would say, yeah, you know what? We just made that stuff up. I don't want to mess with this anymore. But none of them have. So those eyewitnesses are saying it's true. And the Wall Street Journal reported on this some 27 years before the James Fox interview. That, my friend, is a smoking gun. Who are these visitors? Who are these UAPs, UFOs? Who are they? What are they? What do they want? There's a lot of theories. Some say this is nothing new. They've always been here. Some say they're keeping an eye on us. We say, well, why wouldn't they want to communicate with us? And one of the arguments I've heard, one of the reasons I've heard is, consider us when we look down at a colony of ants. Okay? Our intelligence so far exceeds a colony of ants that why would we ever want to make contact and communicate with a colony of ants? It would never cross our mind. Are these visitors so advanced that they see us as a colony of ants? I don't know. I'm not sure. But it's an intriguing story. I love to report on these. And if nothing else, it makes you scratch your head. And you may say, hey, I buy this 100%. Or, Strong, you're full of baloney. But if I'm full of baloney, and if this is all wrong, explain the Wall Street Journal story from June 28th, 1996. That's it. I'm done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's the email address. Hope you enjoyed the podcast today. I'll have another one next week. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's my email address. The best way to get the podcast, send me an email. I will send you a link to the podcast upon publication. You can then download it and listen to it at your leisure. And you can pick it up. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. Just pick it up anywhere where you pick up podcasts, okay? That's it. I'm done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.